The sky above Blackwood Cemetery wasn't just gray, it was the color of a bruised lung, suffocating the freezing earth below. A relentless November rain slashed diagonally across the landscape, turning the manicured lawns of upstate New York into a bog of freezing mud and decaying leaves. Through the iron gates, a phantom glided silently over the wet asphalt, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, black as a hearse and twice as expensive. It came to a halt near the tree line, its engine purring like a sleeping beast before dying into silence. The driver's door opened, and Julian Sterling stepped out into the deluge. At 35, Julian was the terrifying definition of American corporate royalty. Clad in a bespoke Tom Ford suit that cost more than most families earned in a year, he possessed the kind of devastating, cold authority that could silence a boardroom with a single glance. But here, amidst the tombstones, the armor of the CEO crumbled. His face was gaunt, his skin pallid, and his eyes were hollowed-out craters, holding a darkness as deep as the Mariana Trench. He didn't open an umbrella. He didn't care that the freezing rain was already soaking into the fine Italian wool of his jacket. In his hand, he gripped a bouquet of white lilies so tightly that the stems were beginning to snap. Julian ignored the path leading to the Sterling family mausoleum, that marble monstrosity where generations of his ancestors rotted in air-conditioned superiority. He hated them. He hated their legacy. Instead, he turned his expensive leather shoes toward the mud, walking purposefully toward Pauper's Edge, a neglected strip of land bordering the dense, encroaching forest. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the NYPD knocked on his penthouse door. 5 years since the closed casket funeral. 5 years since he buried Elena, the only woman who had ever looked at him and seen a man, not a bank account. He had buried her here, away from his family, because she had always said the Sterling estate felt like a prison. He wanted her to be free, even in death. "I'm here, Elle," Julian whispered, his voice cracking, lost instantly in the wind. He approached the lone granite marker under a weeping willow. Usually this section of the cemetery was a graveyard of memories, moss-covered stones, overgrown weeds, the neglect of the forgotten. But today Julian froze. His breath hitched in his throat. Elena's grave was pristine. While the surrounding headstones were drowning in lichen and dead maple leaves, Elena's modest marker shone as if it had been polished that very morning. The soil around it was dark, rich, and completely free of weeds. And there, placed reverently in the center of the wet earth, was not a store-bought arrangement, but a jar filled with fresh dandelions. Julian blinked, rain dripping from his lashes. Dandelions, weeds to the world, but gold to a child. Elena used to love them. But who would tend to a forgotten grave in this weather? Who would polish the stone of a woman who supposedly died a stranger to this town? A snap of a twig echoed from the forest line. Julian's head snapped up. Through the veil of rain and mist, about 50 yards away, he saw a figure retreating into the shadows of the pines. It was a woman, draped in a torn, oversized clear plastic poncho that looked more like a trash bag than clothing. She wasn't walking like a groundskeeper. She moved with a heavy, slumped posture, burdened by a sorrow that seemed to bend her spine. Panic, irrational and electric, shot through Julian's veins. "Excuse me," Julian called out, his voice raw, cutting through the sound of the rain. "Miss, wait!" The figure didn't stop. She seemed to shudder, pulling the plastic hood tighter, and quickened her pace toward the darkness of the woods. The woman froze. She didn't turn immediately. For a heartbeat, she stood statuesque against the backdrop of dripping pines, her silhouette broken and jagged under the plastic poncho. The air around Julian Sterling felt charged, heavy with ozone and the impending violence of a storm that was no longer just meteorological, but personal. "Miss!" Julian shouted again, taking a step forward. "You dropped something." It was a lie. She hadn't dropped anything yet. but the desperation in his voice acted like a physical tether, yanking her attention back. Slowly, agonizingly, the figure turned. At that precise second, the heavens cracked open. A jagged vein of lightning tore through the charcoal sky, illuminating the cemetery in a stark, blinding strobe of white light. It stripped away the shadows, the rain and the distance, leaving only the raw truth exposed in a millisecond of brilliance. Julian saw her face. It was gaunt, hollowed by malnutrition and etched with lines of exhaustion that shouldn't have been on a woman of 30. Her skin was the color of old parchment, but the lightning didn't lie. It highlighted the one detail that no plastic surgeon could replicate. The one flaw Julian had kissed 1,000 times in the dark. There, high on her left cheekbone, was a crescent-shaped scar, a jagged sliver of white tissue left behind by a childhood fall from a swing set. The bouquet of lilies slipped from Julian's numb fingers, hitting the mud with a wet slap that he didn't even hear. The world didn't just stop, it shattered. The ground beneath his Italian leather shoes seemed to liquefy, dropping him into a free fall of cognitive dissonance. Elena. The name tore out of his throat, raw and bloody, a sound that wasn't quite human. It was the howl of a man who had just seen the contents of a coffin standing upright. Elena didn't smile. She didn't cry out in relief. As her eyes locked onto his, they widened into saucers of absolute primal terror. She looked at Julian not as a husband, not as a savior, but as if he were the angel of death come to drag her to hell. It was a look of horror so profound it punched the breath right out of his lungs. "No," she whimpered, the sound barely audible over the wind. "Not you! You're not real!" She scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the wet grass. In her panic, she dropped the plastic bucket she had been clutching under her poncho. It hit a gravestone with a hollow clack, spilling its contents, a scrub brush, a bottle of cheap bleach, and a rag. She hadn't been mourning. She had been cleaning. She had been scrubbing the moss off her own tombstone. "Elena, stop!" Julian lunged forward, the shock giving way to adrenaline. She bolted. Like a frightened deer, she spun around and sprinted toward a gap in the rusted chain-link fence that separated the cemetery from the dense, unkempt woods beyond. "Elena!" Julian screamed, abandoning all dignity. He ran, but the cemetery fought him. His Tom Ford suit, designed for boardrooms and galas, was a straitjacket in the storm. His dress shoes, smooth-soled and polished, found no purchase in the slick mud. He slid, stumbled, and clawed at the air, his balance compromised by the sheer violence of his own heartbeat. Elena was faster. Poverty had made her nimble. Fear had made her desperate. She dove through the jagged hole in the fence, the metal tearing at her poncho. Julian reached the fence seconds later, ripping his expensive jacket on the wire as he squeezed through. He burst into the service road, a narrow gravel track hidden by the trees. There, hidden in the brush, was her getaway vehicle. It wasn't a car. It was a rusted, beat-up scooter from the 1990s, its paint flaking off to reveal the oxidized metal beneath. It looked like a piece of scrap that belonged in a compactor, not on the road. Elena threw herself onto the seat, jamming a key into the ignition with trembling hands. "Elena, please, it's me!" Julian was 20 feet away, 15. She kicked the starter. The engine coughed a dry, wheezing death rattle. Cough, sputter, silence. "Don't do this!" Julian roared, closing the distance. He could see the panic vibrating off her, the way her knuckles turned white on the handlebars. She kicked it again, putting her entire body weight into the motion. Vroom! The engine roared to life, spewing a cloud of thick, black smoke that smelled of burning oil and gasoline. Julian lunged. His fingertips grazed the slippery plastic of her poncho. He felt the heat of her body. The reality of her existence solid, warm, alive. But the mud betrayed him. His right foot slid out from under him on the gravel. Julian crashed face first into the slurry of dirt and oil. The impact knocked the wind out of him, filling his mouth with the metallic taste of blood and earth. He scrambled to push himself up, spitting out grit, but he was too late. Through the haze of rain and exhaust, he watched the single dim taillight of the scooter wobble and then stabilize, disappearing down the dark service road like a fading ember. He was alone. Again. Panting, shivering uncontrollably, Julian collapsed back onto the gravel. The rain beat down on him, mixing with the mud that now coated the finest suit money could buy. He pounded his fist into the ground, a guttural roar of frustration ripping from his throat. Then, something glinted in the mud mere inches from his nose. It was half buried in the tire track left by the scooter, a locket. Julian reached out, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grasp it. It was a cheap brass trinket, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $5. It was tarnished, the metal smelling of copper. Slowly, terrifyingly, he pried it open with a muddy thumbnail. Inside, protected by a small circle of plastic, was a picture. It wasn't a photo of a child or a saint. It was a picture of him. It was a clipping from a newspaper, grainy and black and white. But someone had taken a pen, a black Sharpie, and drawn a small, delicate black ribbon across the corner of his photo. A mourning ribbon. Julian stared at the image of himself in the locket, lying in the mud of the cemetery where his wife was supposed to be buried. The realization hit him harder than the fall. She wasn't running because she hated him. She was running because she thought he was dead. She was carrying his ghost around her neck, just as he had carried hers in his heart. He snapped the locket shut, enclosing it in his fist until the metal bit into his palm. The billionaire lay in the dirt, the rain washing the blood from his lip, his eyes hardening into steel. She was alive, and he was going to burn the world down to find out why she thought he wasn't. Julian slammed the heavy door of the Rolls-Royce, sealing himself inside the hermetically sealed silence of the cabin. The storm raged against the reinforced glass, but inside, the air was still and smelled of expensive leather and conditioned oxygen. He sat there for a moment, his chest heaving, his breath fogging the rearview mirror. He looked down at himself. The Tom Ford suit was ruined, caked in cemetery mud and grease from the service road. His hands were shaking violently, still clutching the cheap brass locket as if it were the nuclear launch codes. She is alive. The thought was a narcotic, intoxicating and dangerous. But Julian Sterling didn't build an empire on hope. He built it on data. He needed proof. He pulled his phone from his sodden pocket, his thumb smearing dirt across the screen as he dialed. "Ray," Julian said the moment the line connected. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a flat line of suppressed hysteria. "Mr. Sterling?" Ray Vance's voice was sharp. The ex-FBI bureau chief, who ran Sterling Global's security, didn't ask why his boss was calling on a Saturday night. "Is there a situation? I need you to hack the Blackwood Cemetery surveillance server. Now, don't ask for a warrant. Burn through their firewall." "Done." "What am I looking for?" "A scooter. Rusted 90s model. It exited the North Service Road 3 minutes ago. I need the plate." "Give me 2 minutes." Julian didn't hang up. He put the phone on speaker and threw it onto the passenger seat. While Vance worked his digital magic, Julian unlocked a hidden folder on his phone, the Elena archive. He hadn't opened it in years. It was too painful. He scrolled past the wedding photos, past the honeymoon in Como, straight to the PDF he had avoided looking at closely since the funeral. Certificate of death, State of New York. He zoomed in. Cause of death: blunt force trauma, incineration. Disposition of remains: burial, closed casket. Julian's eyes narrowed. The memory of that week was a blur of whiskey and sedatives administered by the family doctor. He had been in London closing the merger when the call came. His mother, Victoria, had handled everything. "There's nothing to see, Julian," she had told him, weeping into her handkerchief. The fire. It took her beauty. Remember her as she was. Don't open the box." He had listened. He had been a coward, paralyzed by grief, and he had let his mother seal the lid on his life. "Closed casket due to severe trauma," Julian whispered, reading the medical examiner's note. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Eris Thorne. Julian knew that name. Thorne was on the Sterling Foundation's payroll. A cold, sick feeling settled in his stomach. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a production. "Got it." Vance's voice cut through the silence. "Grainy, but I ran an enhancement algorithm. New Jersey plates registered to a P.O. box in the Ironworks District, Newark." Newark. The Ironworks. The name tasted like ash. It was a decaying industrial graveyard, a place where the American dream went to die of overdose and foreclosure. It was less than 50 miles from his estate, yet it might as well have been on Mars. "Send the coordinates to my burner phone," Julian ordered. "And Ray, this conversation never happened." "Understood." Julian hung up and immediately dialed a second number. This time it was Judge Halloway, a man whose career Julian had single-handedly financed. "Julian?" The judge sounded groggy. "I need an order, Arthur. Tonight. I need an exhumation order for the Blackwood plot. Plot 402. "Exhumation? Julian, that's your wife's grave. The press will have a field day. You need probable cause." "I don't care about the press," Julian hissed, starting the engine. "I want to know what the hell or who the hell I've been mourning for 5 years. Sign the paper, Arthur, or I release the files on your Cayman accounts." He hung up before the judge could stutter a reply. Julian threw the Rolls-Royce into gear, tires spinning on the wet asphalt as he tore out of the cemetery. But he couldn't go to Newark like this. The Rolls-Royce in the Ironworks district would be a beacon, a target. And Julian Sterling, the face of Forbes, would be recognized instantly. He drove 20 minutes to a sprawling, fluorescent-lit 24-hour superstore off the interstate. He parked in the shadows, far from the entrance. Inside, the harsh white light was disorienting. He walked past aisles of bulk cereal and discount electronics, a ghost haunting the mundane world. He grabbed a cart. He stripped the persona of the billionaire. Into the cart went a pair of stiff, dark denim jeans, heavy work boots, and a nondescript charcoal hoodie. He bought a black baseball cap and a cheap prepaid smartphone. In the store's bathroom, Julian Sterling ceased to exist. He peeled off the muddy, ruined Tom Ford suit of $5,000 skin and stuffed it into a trash bag. He pulled on the stiff jeans and the hoodie. He looked in the mirror. The shadows under his eyes and the stubble on his jaw completed the transformation. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a man with nothing left to lose. He walked out, leaving the trash bag in a dumpster. He drove the Rolls-Royce to a private, automated storage garage he owned in the city outskirts, a vault for his classic car collection. He parked the beast next to a dusty mid-range sedan he kept for audits. Transferring the locket and the new phone into his pocket, Julian climbed into the sedan. He turned the key, and the unremarkable engine hummed to life. He set the GPS for the Ironworks district. The billionaire was dead. The hunter was born, and he was driving straight into the rust and the rot to find the ghost who had cleaned his grave. The transition from the manicured silence of the interstate to the Ironworks district of Newark was not gradual. It was a violent plunge into an open wound. Julian Sterling gripped the steering wheel of the rental sedan, his knuckles white against the cheap plastic as the scenery decayed around him. The skyscrapers of Manhattan were just a glowing rumor in the rearview mirror, replaced by the skeletal remains of abandoned factories and smokestacks that clawed at the charcoal sky like dead fingers. The air here was different. Even through the car's vents, Julian could smell it, a cocktail of sulfur, wet rot, and the metallic tang of old industry. It was the smell of the American dream that had rusted shut decades ago. He turned onto Slag Avenue. The streetlights flickered with a dying yellow jaundice, casting long shadows over piles of uncollected trash. He found the address from the license plate search, number 402. It wasn't a home. It was a brick coffin standing upright. The tenement building was a crumbling monolith of soot-stained masonry, its windows barred with rusted iron, its fire escape clinging to the facade like a fractured spine. It was a place where people existed, but did not live. Julian parked the sedan in the shadow of a derelict warehouse across the street. He pulled the hood of his sweatshirt up, hiding the face that had graced the cover of Fortune magazine, and stepped out into the drizzle. He felt like an astronaut on a hostile planet, his work boots heavy on the cracked sidewalk. He needed intel before he breached the perimeter. He walked into a small, cramped bodega on the corner, the bell above the door jingling with a tinny, pathetic sound. The shop smelled of stale coffee and pine sol. "Pack of American spirits," Julian muttered to the man behind the counter, keeping his head down. The owner, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, slid the cigarettes across the scratched plexiglass. "I'm looking for a woman," Julian said, his voice low. "Lives in 402, has a scar right here." He traced a crescent on his own cheekbone. The owner paused, his eyes narrowing. "You a cop? Or a bill collector?" "Neither. Just an old friend." Julian slid a $100 bill across the counter. The man sighed, pocketing the cash. "That's Lena. Quiet girl, sad. Works 3 jobs cleaning, laundry, God knows what else. Always pays in cash, always late. Don't cause her trouble, man. She's got enough. She's got enough." The words twisted the knife in Julian's gut. He walked back out and positioned himself in the deep shadows of an alleyway facing the tenement's entrance. He waited. The rain had slowed to a miserable mist. 20 minutes later, the heavy metal door of the tenement groaned open. Julian's breath stopped. A small boy, no older than 5, burst out onto the sidewalk. He was wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled up in thick cuffs. He was chasing a stray, mangy cat, laughing with a pure, unadulterated joy that seemed alien in this gray wasteland. Julian leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The boy turned, catching the light from the street lamp. The world tilted on its axis. The boy had messy, dark hair, but the face... It was a genetic mirror. He had the sterling jawline sharp and defined even in childhood, but it was the eyes that shattered Julian. They were gray, steel gray, the distinctive icy shade that had run in the Sterling bloodline for 4 generations. He wasn't just looking at a child, he was looking at himself 25 years ago. The timeline. The math hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. Elena had been pregnant. She had been pregnant when she died. "Leo, don't run too far." The voice was raspy, exhausted, but unmistakably hers. Elena stepped out of the building. She was limping slightly, favoring her left leg a souvenir from her escape in the cemetery. She was dragging a massive, overstuffed laundry bag that looked heavy enough to crush her. She looked terrified. Her head swiveled constantly, checking the shadows, checking the windows, her body coiled tight with the hyper-vigilance of the hunted. Julian watched, paralyzed, as his dead wife, knelt down to zip up the boy's coat. She kissed his forehead, a gesture of fierce, protective love that Julian had starved for in his empty mansion. 2 women standing on the stoop smoking menthols under a torn awning watched Elena struggle with the laundry bag. Their voices carried across the narrow street to where Julian stood frozen in the dark. "Poor girl," one of the women murmured, exhaling a plume of smoke. "That slumlord Russo was screaming at her again this morning. She's short on rent." "She works herself to the bone," the other replied, shaking her head. "Tragic, really. You know she used to be somebody before the accident." "Yeah. Shame about her husband dying in that plane crash. Left her with nothing but the kid and the debts." Julian's blood ran cold. The ambient noise of the city seemed to mute into a dull roar. Plane crash? He gripped the rough brick of the alley wall to keep from falling. His mother had told him Elena died in a car accident. She had told the world it was a tragedy on the highway. But Elena believed he had died in a plane crash. The narratives didn't match. It wasn't just a lie, it was a carefully constructed, bifurcated reality. Someone had crafted two separate tragedies to ensure that neither of them would ever look for the other. He watched Elena hoist the heavy bag onto her shoulder, wincing in pain, and take the small hand of his son. They walked into the darkness of the street, a widow and an orphan, mourning a man who was standing 30 feet away, watching them suffer. Julian Sterling didn't move. He couldn't. The rage that ignited in his chest was cold, blue, and absolutely lethal. He wasn't just going to fix this, he was going to execute everyone who had built this stage. Julian remained in the shadows of the alley, a silent predator in a jungle of concrete and rust, watching the tableau of misery unfold before him. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a damp, heavy silence that amplified every sound on Slag Avenue. A beat-up Lincoln Town car swerved to the curb, tires screeching against the cracked pavement. A man stepped out, Tony Russo. He was a caricature of a slumlord, wearing a cheap, shiny suit that strained against his gut and smelling of stale cigar smoke and cheap cologne. He didn't walk. He stomped toward the tenement entrance, intercepting Elena just as she reached the door with Leo. Julian tensed, his muscles coiling under the rough denim of his disguise. He moved closer, pressing himself against the cold brick wall, close enough to hear the venom in Russo's voice. "You're dodging me, Elena," Russo barked, blocking her path. "Rent was due Tuesday. It's Friday." "Mr. Russo, please." Elena's voice was thin, trembling with a fatigue that went down to her marrow. She pulled Leo closer to her leg, shielding him with her laundry bag. "I have half. I just need 2 more days. The laundromat pays me on Sunday." "I don't care about your laundry," Russo shouted, his spit flying. "I got a list of people waiting for this unit. People with actual money. You got 24 hours. You pay the full 800 or you're out." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a sinister, oily whisper that made Julian's vision blur with red rage. "And if I have to kick you out, I'm calling Child Protective Services. A woman living in a dump with no heat and no husband. They'll take the kid before you even get your bags packed." Elena gasped, a sound of pure, suffocating fear. "No, please, not Leo. He's sick. He needs to stay warm." "Then pay me," Russo spat. He turned on his heel and marched back to his car, leaving Elena shivering on the stoop, clutching her son as if he were the only anchor in a hurricane. Julian stood in the darkness, his fingernails digging into his palms until the skin broke. The urge to step out, to break Russo's jaw and buy the entire block just to evict him, was overwhelming. But the flashing lights of a police cruiser passing at the end of the block forced him to freeze. He couldn't be arrested. Not tonight. Not while he was a ghost. He waited until Elena hurried inside, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind her. Julian crossed the street. He didn't need a key code. The lock on the main door was broken, hanging loosely by a wire, a security feature of the poor. He slipped inside. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp drywall. He found apartment 1B. He could hear them inside, the murmur of a mother's comfort, the soft wheezing cough of a child. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his hoodie. He pulled out a thick white envelope containing $5,000, his go bag cash, meant for corporate emergencies, kidnappings, or bribes. He pulled a pen from his pocket and scrawled 3 words on the outside in block letters, disguising his distinctive handwriting for the boy. He knelt and slid the envelope under the gap of the warped wooden door. Then he moved to the side, peering through a crack in the Venetian blinds that covered the single, street-facing window. The apartment was a cell, 1 room, a mattress on the floor, a hot plate. The peeling paint hung in strips like dead skin. It was colder inside than out. He watched Elena spot the white corner of the envelope. She froze, then lunged for it. She tore it open, and when she saw the stack of $100 bills, she didn't cheer. She collapsed. She fell to her knees, pressing the money to her forehead, weeping silently, her shoulders shaking with the release of 1,000 pounds of pressure. She looked up at the water-stained ceiling and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Then she did something that stopped Julian's heart. She took the money not to her purse, but to a small, wobbly table in the corner of the room. It was a makeshift altar. A single white candle flickered there, casting long, dancing shadows against the wall. Next to the candle was a stick of burning incense and a small vase with the dandelion she had picked earlier. And in the center, inside a cheap plastic frame, was a photo. It wasn't a wedding photo. It wasn't a candid shot from their honeymoon. It was a press headshot, glossy, distant, the kind used for annual reports. It was the only image of him she must have been able to find after running away with nothing. Elena lit the candle. She knelt before the photo of Julian, her hands clasped in reverence. She wasn't just remembering a husband, she was worshiping a saint. She spoke to the picture, her lips moving in a silent liturgy of love and grief, asking the dead man to watch over their son. Julian felt a physical crack in his chest. She was praying to him. She was starving, freezing, and terrified, yet she was using her last ounce of energy to honor the memory of the man she thought had abandoned her to death. From the mattress on the floor, Leo sat up. "Mama?" The boy coughed, a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the small room. "My chest hurts." Elena abandoned the shrine instantly, rushing to the mattress to wrap the boy in thin, threadbare blankets. "I know, baby, I know. Shh. Daddy is watching. Daddy sent us a miracle. Daddy sent us a miracle." That broke him. The wall of discipline Julian had built over 35 years crumbled into dust. He wasn't the CEO of Sterling Global anymore. He wasn't a grieving widower. He was a father listening to his son suffer in the cold, while a slumlord threatened to tear their family apart. The distance he had maintained for strategy was now an act of cruelty. He couldn't stay outside. He couldn't be a ghost for one more second. Julian stepped back from the window. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He gripped the doorknob. It was locked. A flimsy deadbolt that offered the illusion of safety. He stepped back and drove the heel of his heavy work boot into the wood just below the lock. Crack! The door splintered and flew open, banging against the interior wall. Julian Sterling stepped into the dim light of the room, the hood of his sweatshirt falling back to reveal the face of the man in the photograph. The shrine flickered in the sudden draft, the candle flame dancing wildly as the dead man walked into the tomb of the living. The sound of the splintering wood was like a gunshot in the confined space of the tenement. Elena didn't gasp. She didn't freeze. She screamed a raw, feral sound of absolute terror that scraped against the peeling paint of the walls. In a split second, she had thrown herself over Leo, shielding the boy's body with her own, curling into a protective ball on the dirty mattress. "No, no, please," she shrieked, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands clutching the boy's head. "I haven't sinned. I kept the promise. Leave us alone." She wasn't looking at a husband. She was cowering before a ghost, a hallucination summoned by her grief and the flickering candlelight of the shrine she had just lit. In her mind, the man standing in the doorway with the face of the saint in the photograph could only be a specter, an omen of death come to collect the rest of her shattered family. Julian stood frozen in the doorway, his chest heaving, the violence of his entry hanging in the air. Seeing the woman he loved, the woman who had once commanded ballrooms with her grace, reduced to a trembling, terrified animal, broke the last of his composure. He didn't shout. He didn't stride forward with the authority of a CEO. He dropped to his knees. The billionaire crawled across the grime-stained linoleum, ignoring the broken glass from the door frame that bit into his denim jeans. He moved slowly, hands raised in surrender, tears carving clean tracks through the mud on his face. "Elena," he choked out, his voice a broken whisper. "I'm not a ghost. Look at me. Please, God, look at me." Elena opened one eye, trembling violently. When she saw him, really saw him, illuminated by the harsh street lamp outside and the wavering candle, her breath hitched. She scrambled backward, pushing herself against the cold radiator, dragging Leo with her. "You died," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "You died in the Atlantic. I saw the papers. Your mother showed me the papers." "No," Julian wept, inching closer. "I'm here. I'm flesh and blood." He reached out. Elena flinched as if he held a knife, but Julian didn't pull back. He grabbed her hand, her rough, calloused hand, ruined by years of scrubbing floors, and yanked it hard against his chest. "Feel this," he commanded, pressing her palm directly over his heart. Thump, 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 thump. The rhythm was frantic, powerful, and undeniably alive. Elena's eyes widened, the pupils blowing out as her brain struggled to reconcile the impossible. Her fingers curled into his sodden hoodie. She felt the heat radiating from his skin. She smelled the rain, the mud, and beneath it all, the faint, lingering scent of the sandalwood cologne he had worn since they were 22. "Warm," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. "I'm real, Elle. I'm real." The dam broke. Elena didn't hug him. She collapsed. Her body went boneless, and she fell forward into him, letting out a wail so agonizing, so full of 5 years of repressed torture, that it sounded like a physical injury. Julian caught her, wrapping his arms around her frail frame, burying his face in her neck, sobbing uncontrollably. They clung to each other on the floor of the slum, a tangle of limbs and sorrow, while Leo sat up, rubbing his sleepy eyes, watching the stranger hold his mother. "How?" Elena gasped between sobs, pulling back to frame his face with her hands, touching his jaw, his eyes, verifying his existence by the millimeter. "Your mother? She came to the hospital. She said your private jet went down over the ocean. She said the company was bankrupt. She said the mob creditors were coming to kill the family, to kill the baby." Julian froze. His tears stopped instantly, replaced by a chill that was colder than the grave he had visited an hour ago. "The mob?" Julian repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Elena, Sterling Global has never been bankrupt. I was in London closing a merger. I never got on a plane." He gripped her shoulders, staring into her eyes with an intensity that frightened her. "What else did she tell you?" "She gave me cash," Elena confessed, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "She said I had to run, that if I stayed or if I contacted anyone, the people who killed you would find Leo. She made me change my name. She made me promise to be dead to the world to keep him safe." Julian closed his eyes, a vein throbbing in his temple. The cruelty of the lie was breathtaking in its precision. Victoria Sterling hadn't just separated them. She had weaponized Elena's love for her unborn child to ensure her silence. "She told me you were dead," Julian said, his voice a flat, dead thing. "She called me in London. She said you drove off the bridge on Route 9. She said the car burned. She said..." The body was unviewable. Elena gasped, covering her mouth. "She held a funeral?" "Yes," Julian hissed, opening his eyes. They were shards of gray ice. "I buried an empty box. I've been visiting an empty grave for 5 years while you were starving 10 miles away." The realization hit them both simultaneously. It wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't fate. It was a play, written and directed by Victoria Sterling. She had orchestrated a Shakespearean nightmare, playing on their deepest fears, Julian's fear of loss and Elena's fear for her child to sever the commoner from the bloodline. Julian looked at Leo. The boy was staring at him with those identical gray eyes, coughing into his fist. The boy was sick. He was hungry. He was living in a rat-infested box because Victoria Sterling wanted to preserve the purity of her legacy. Julian slowly released Elena and turned to his son. He reached out a trembling hand and, for the first time, touched the boy's cheek. It was hot, feverish. "Who are you?" Leo asked, his voice small and raspy. "I'm your father," Julian said, his voice cracking. He looked back at Elena, and the grief in his face hardened into a terrifying resolve. The man who had entered the room was searching for a ghost. The man sitting on the floor now was a warlord preparing for a massacre. "We are leaving," Julian stated, standing up and pulling Elena with him. "Pack only what matters. Leave the rest. Leave the rags. Leave the furniture. You are never spending another second in this hell." "But the creditors," Elena whispered, the old fear still clutching her heart. "The men who killed you." "There are no creditors, Elena," Julian said, grabbing the picture of himself from the shrine and smashing the cheap plastic frame in his hand. "There is only my mother, and God help her when I get home." Julian stood amidst the wreckage of the poverty his wife had endured for 5 years. The shattered glass of the picture frame crunched under his heavy boots as he surveyed the room, the single hot plate, the bucket of dirty water, the mattress that smelled of damp wool. It was a museum of suffering, and every artifact within it was an indictment of his own ignorance. He watched Elena frantically stuffing a few worn t-shirts into a plastic grocery bag. Her hands were shaking. She moved with the desperate haste of someone expecting the roof to collapse at any moment. "Stop," Julian said, his voice surprisingly soft. He reached out and gently took the bag from her hands, letting it drop to the floor. "You don't need any of this. We buy everything new. Tonight." Elena looked up, her eyes darting to the door. "But the money, Julian. We can't just leave. I have to pay Russo and Marcus. Marcus comes tomorrow for the collection." Julian stiffened. The name hung in the stale air like toxic smoke. "Marcus? Your cousin," Elena whispered, looking over her shoulder as if the walls had ears. "He found me 3 months after I ran. He was the only one who tracked me down." Julian felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. Marcus Sterling, his mother's nephew, a man Julian had always considered a harmless, sycophantic leech who hung around the estate drinking the good scotch and complaining about his trust fund. "He found you?" Julian asked, his voice tight. "And he didn't tell me?" "He couldn't," Elena insisted, defending the man. "He told me that if he told you, the mob would find out. He said he was risking his life just coming here. He brings me the allowance from the estate, the leftovers after paying your debts." Julian blinked, his mind reeling. "Debts? What debts?" "The bankruptcy," Elena explained, tears welling up again. "Marcus said you were living in hiding, too, somewhere in the Midwest, destitute. He said the family is paying off the creditors. Millions of dollars. He brings me what he can scrape together so Leo and I don't starve. $500 a month." The number hit Julian like a physical slap. $500. The math coalesced in Julian's mind, sharp and bloody. "I give Marcus Sterling $10,000 a month," Julian said, the words falling from his lips like stones. "I appointed him head of the Elena Memorial Charity 4 years ago. He claims he uses the funds for anonymous donations to battered women's shelters." Elena stared at him, confused. "But he drives an old Honda. He wears torn clothes when he comes here. He says he's broke." "It's a costume, Elena," Julian hissed, the rage vibrating in his chest. "Just last week, Marcus posted a photo of his new Porsche 911 on Instagram. He's not scraping together leftovers. He is skimming 95% of the money I give him, and he's giving you crumbs to keep you alive enough to suffer, but too poor to leave." The realization was nauseating. Marcus hadn't just been complicit in Victoria's lie, he had monetized it. He had turned Elena's hiding place into a private income stream. He had looked at a grieving mother and a sick child and saw a line item in his personal ledger. He kept them terrified with stories of imaginary mobsters while he ate steak dinners on their dime. Julian walked over to the mattress where Leo sat, watching them with wide, feverish eyes. The boy coughed, a wet, rattling sound that tore through Julian's heart. "He let my son eat instant noodles," Julian whispered to the room, "while he bought sports cars." The sorrow in Julian's eyes evaporated, replaced by a glacial, terrifying clarity. The grieving husband was gone. The ruthlessly efficient CEO had returned, and he was declaring war. He bent down and scooped Leo up into his arms. The boy was shockingly light bird bones, wrapped in too many layers of cheap polyester. Leo stiffened at first, then rested his head tentatively against Julian's shoulder, seeking the warmth. "We are leaving," Julian commanded. "Now." He didn't wait for Elena to argue. He grabbed her hand with his free hand, intertwining their fingers in a grip that promised he would never let go again. They walked out of the apartment, leaving the door wide open. They left the shrine, the dandelion, and the $5,000 on the floor. As they stepped into the hallway, the door to the neighboring unit cracked open. The two women who had been gossiping earlier peered out, their eyes widening as they saw the ghost carrying the sick boy. "Is that?" one of them whispered. Julian ignored them. He kicked the front door of the tenement open and stepped out into the cool night air of Slag Avenue. Russo, the landlord, was still leaning against his Lincoln, lighting a fresh cigar. When he saw Elena walking out with a stranger, he pushed himself off the car, ready to shout another threat. "Hey, where do you think you're—" Russo's words died in his throat. A cavalcade of headlights swept around the corner, blinding him. A massive black Cadillac Escalade, armored, tinted, and radiating authority, screeched to a halt directly in front of the tenement, blocking Russo's Lincoln. The driver's door opened, and Ray Vance stepped out. The ex-FBI chief looked at the tenement, then at Julian holding the boy, and his professional mask cracked for a split second. He saw the mud on Julian's face, the rage in his stance, and the woman who was supposed to be dead. Vance didn't ask a single question. He simply opened the rear door of the Escalade. "Mr. Sterling," Vance said, his voice carrying clearly in the silent street. "Mrs. Sterling." Russo dropped his cigar. The burning ember sparked on the pavement. The name Sterling echoed in the slumlord's ears like a death knell. He looked at the bum in the hoodie, then at the luxury tank, and realized with dawning horror that he had just spent 2 years threatening the wife of the man who owned half the state. Julian paused before getting in. He looked at Russo. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the man with eyes that promised a reckoning so complete it would leave nothing but scorched earth. "Get in, Elena," Julian said softly. He placed Leo gently onto the pristine leather seats, climbed in beside them, and the heavy door slammed shut, sealing them away from the smell of sulfur and the rot of the ironworks forever. The armored Cadillac Escalade sliced through the night like a black shark moving through deep water. Inside, the silence was absolute, hermetically sealed against the chaos of the world they had just left behind. Julian sat in the back, Leo asleep in his lap, the boy's feverish breath hitching against Julian's chest. Next to him, Elena stared out the tinted window, watching the decay of the ironworks district dissolve into the generic sprawl of the highway, and finally into the manicured darkness of the Connecticut suburbs. 50 miles. That was the physical distance between the rat-infested tenement on Slag Avenue and the gates of the Sterling estate in Greenwich. But as they crossed the state line, Julian realized it wasn't just a distance of miles, it was a distance of galaxies. He had traversed a universe of suffering tonight, and now he was bringing the wreckage back to the source. "We're here," Ray Vance murmured from the driver's seat. The headlights swept across the massive wrought iron gates, illuminating the family crest, a lion holding a sword forged in cold steel. The gates swung open automatically, recognizing the transponder, granting entry to the fortress that had kept the truth locked out for 5 years. The driveway was a mile long, lined with ancient oaks that stood like sentinels. At the end of it sat Sterling Manor. It was a limestone behemoth, bathed in architectural uplighting that made it glow against the black sky. To the world, it was a symbol of American dynastic power. To Elena, who shrank back into the leather seat as it came into view, it was the haunted castle where her life had been stolen. "It's okay," Julian whispered, squeezing her hand. His voice was rough, dangerous. "You aren't a guest this time. You're the owner." Vance stopped the car at the main portico. Julian didn't wait for the door to be opened. He stepped out carrying Leo, his work boots leaving muddy prints on the pristine cobblestones. He looked like a barbarian at the gates of Rome, clad in a dirty hoodie, unshaven, holding a sick child like a shield. He bypassed the grand front entrance. He walked to the side door, the private family entrance. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. Beep. Access granted. The lock clicked open. The house that Victoria Sterling thought she controlled yielded to its true master. They stepped inside. The air in the hallway was warm, scented with fresh-cut lilies and beeswax. It was the smell of money, old, quiet, and suffocating. From down the long marble corridor, the sound of music drifted toward them. It was Opera Maria Callas singing Casta Diva. The soaring, tragic soprano notes echoed off the vaulted ceilings, filling the silence of the house with a veneer of culture that masked the rot beneath. "Stay close to me," Julian commanded softly. He led Elena and the sleeping boy toward the drawing room. The double mahogany doors were slightly ajar. Through the crack, flickering firelight spilled out onto the Persian rug. Julian stopped. He listened. "The suspension is incredible." "Aunt Victoria," a male voice laughed, slurred, arrogant. 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. You have to come see it. The Miami blue paint cost an extra 12 grand alone." It was Marcus. Julian felt the blood pulse behind his eyes. He tightened his grip on Leo. "Pour me another, Marcus," came the reply. Victoria Sterling's voice. It was cool, imperious, the voice of a woman who slept soundly at night. "And do stop bragging, it's vulgar. Though I suppose you deserve a treat. Dealing with loose ends is tiresome work." "She's fine," Marcus chuckled, the clink of crystal on crystal ringing out. "She's durable, like a cockroach. As long as the checks keep coming, she stays in her hole." Elena let out a small, strangled gasp behind Julian. The cruelty was so casual, so mundane. They were discussing her life, her starvation, over vintage cognac. Julian didn't wait another second. He kicked the mahogany doors open. Bang! The heavy wood slammed against the interior walls, the sound violent enough to drown out Maria Callas. The scene inside froze. Victoria Sterling was seated in her wingback velvet chair by the roaring fireplace, a greyhound sleeping at her feet. She held a snifter of Louis XIII cognac. Marcus stood by the drink cart, a crystal decanter in one hand, his other hand playing with the keys to a Porsche. They both turned. For 3 seconds, no one breathed. The image was incongruous to the point of absurdity. Julian Sterling, the prodigal son, standing in the center of the room covered in Newark mud, wearing a $5 hoodie. In his arms, a child. Beside him, a woman who had been buried 5 years ago. Victoria's eyes went wide. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax doll. Her hand went slack. Smash. The snifter dropped. $5,000 of cognac and crystal shattered on the limestone hearth, the amber liquid hissing as it splashed into the fire. Marcus choked. He literally choked on his drink, coughing violently, his face turning a blotchy red as he stared at Elena, as if the floor had just opened up to swallow him. Julian walked forward. His steps were heavy, deliberate. He walked right onto the priceless antique rug, grinding the dirt from the cemetery and the slum into the fibers. He stopped 5 feet from his mother. The firelight danced on his face, illuminating the cold, hard lines of a man who had finally woken up. The opera music reached its crescendo, a high, piercing note of tragedy. Julian looked at the woman who had birthed him, then at the cousin who had sold him. He shifted Leo slightly in his arms, the boy's dark hair falling over his forehead, the undeniable sterling air. "Turn the music off," Julian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a judge passing a death sentence. Marcus scrambled to the stereo, his hands shaking so hard he nearly knocked it over, silencing the room. The only sound left was the crackle of the fire and the terrified wheezing of the sick boy. Julian stared into his mother's terrified eyes. "I brought you a guest, Mother," Julian said, his voice void of any warmth. He gestured slightly to the ghost at his side. "And your grandson." The silence in the drawing room wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, but the warmth died before it reached the center of the room where Julian stood. He walked over to a velvet chaise lounge and gently set Leo down. The boy, feverish and exhausted from the car ride, curled up instantly, clutching the dirty hem of Julian's hoodie. Julian straightened his spine. He turned back to the 2 people who had dismantled his life, his shadow stretching long and dark across the Persian rug. "Why?" Julian asked. One word, simple, yet it carried enough force to crack the limestone walls. Victoria Sterling didn't deny it. She didn't feign ignorance. She slumped in her wingback chair, looking suddenly ancient, the imperious matriarch reduced to a trembling old woman. She wept, but her tears weren't for Elena. They were for herself, for the shattering of her carefully constructed world. "I had to," she sobbed, her hands shaking as she reached for the spilled cognac, finding only air. "The stars, Julian, the alignment. Don't you remember your father? Your grandfather?" "My father died of a heart attack, Mother, not magic." "He died because he married beneath him," Victoria shrieked, a flash of her old madness sparking in her eyes. "The Sterling curse. Every male heir who brings a commoner into the inner circle dies before his 40th birthday. I consulted Madame Voronin. She cast the charts the week you proposed. She saw it, Julian. Elena's horoscope. It was a black void. She was the harbinger of your death." Julian stared at her, horrified. He had expected greed or snobbery. He hadn't expected this, a Gothic, superstitious rot at the core of their modern empire. "So you killed her?" Julian's voice was a whisper of disbelief. "To save me from a horoscope?" "I saved your life," Victoria insisted, clutching her pearls. "I didn't kill her, I simply removed her. The body in the grave, it was a Jane Doe, an addict from the city morgue. I paid the coroner to look the other way. I bought a corpse to fill a box so you would stop looking for a woman who was going to bury you." "You didn't save me," Julian said, stepping closer, his gray eyes burning. "You hollowed me out. You left me breathing, but you killed everything that made me a man." He turned away from her. The madness of a mother he could almost comprehend as a twisted form of love, but there was another predator in the room. Julian turned his gaze to Marcus. His cousin was inching toward the door, sweat beading on his forehead, his car keys jingling softly in his trembling hand. "And you, Marcus?" Julian asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low rumble of impending violence. "Did the stars tell you to steal $600,000? Marcus froze. "Julian, wait. I was just managing the situation. Expenses." Julian reached into the back pocket of his jeans. He pulled out a tablet he had taken from the car of Vance's security pad. He tapped the screen and threw it onto the coffee table. It skidded across the mahogany surface, stopping right in front of Victoria. The screen displayed a forensic accounting of the Eleni Memorial Charity. "I gave you $10,000 a month." Julian said, walking toward Marcus until he was inches from his face. Money meant to help battered women. Money you claimed you were using to keep Elena hidden and safe from these imaginary mobsters. Julian pointed a finger at the shivering Elena. She lived on $500 a month. 500. She ate canned beans while you bought a Porsche 911 in Miami Blue. I had overhead, Marcus stammered, backing up until he hit the wall. You let my son sleep on a floor with rats, Julian roared, the sound exploding in the room. He grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his expensive cashmere blazer and slammed him against the bookshelf. You looked at my starving child and you saw a line item in your personal ledger. You aren't superstitious, Marcus. You're a parasite. Marcus whimpered, his feet dangling off the floor. I'm family, Julian. You can't... Julian dropped him. Marcus crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. You are nothing, Julian pronounced, looming over him. As of this second, your access to the Sterling Trust is revoked. Your accounts are frozen. The Porsche, the loft in Soho, the watch on your wrist, it's all mine. Vance is waiting outside. He will drive you to the state line. Julian leaned down, his face a mask of cold fury. If you are ever seen in New York or Connecticut again, I will hand this tablet to the district attorney. Embezzlement, fraud, extortion. You'll die in prison, Marcus. Get out. Marcus didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet, sobbing like a child, and ran out the open doors, leaving his dignity and his future on the drawing room floor. The room fell silent again, save for the crackling fire. Julian turned back to his mother. Victoria was staring at the tablet, then at Elena, and finally, her eyes landed on the sleeping boy on the chaise lounge. He looks like you, Victoria whispered, her voice hollow. He is me, Julian said. He is the future you were so terrified of that you almost destroyed it. He walked over to the fireplace and stood before her. I won't kick you out, Mother. The press would ask questions. Victoria looked up, a flicker of hope in her eyes. But you are done, Julian continued, extinguishing that hope instantly. You are banished to the East Wing. You will not attend board meetings. You will not access the family accounts. You will never sign another check or give another order in this house. You will live here like a ghost, haunting the halls of the empire you no longer control. Julian, please, she wept. I'm your mother. And she was my wife, Julian said, pointing to Elena. And that is my son. You chose your curse over your blood. Now you have to live with it. Suddenly a small sound broke the tension. A cough. Leo stirred on the chaise. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, looking small and fragile in the vast, opulent room. He looked at the weeping old woman in the chair, then at his father. Daddy? Leo rasped. I'm thirsty. The word hung in the air. Daddy. Victoria Sterling flinched as if she had been slapped. She looked at the boy, the living, breathing refutation of her astrologer's prophecy. The Sterling line hadn't ended. It had survived in spite of her. The realization of what she had almost thrown away a grandson, a legacy, seemed to crush her into the velvet chair. Julian turned his back on her. He walked to the liquor cart, poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher, and brought it to his son. He knelt down, ignoring the woman who had birthed him, and focused entirely on the family he had resurrected from the dead. I've got you, Leo, Julian whispered. I've got you. The glass of water trembled in Leo's small hands as he drank, the sound of his swallowing the only noise in the cavernous drawing room. Julian remained kneeling, his back turned to his mother, acting as a physical barricade between his son and the woman whose superstitions had nearly erased him. But the silence was broken by the rustle of cheap denim. Elena stepped forward. She moved slowly, limping slightly on her bad leg, but her head was high. She was no longer the cowering fugitive hiding in a tenement. She was the matriarch of a family that had survived a war. She walked past Julian, past the warmth of the fireplace, and stopped directly in front of the velvet wingback chair where Victoria Sterling sat crumpled like a discarded marionette. Julian tensed, ready to intercept, but Elena raised a hand to stop him. She looked down at the old woman. Victoria stared back, her eyes rimmed with red, waiting for the final blow, the curse, the scream, the retribution. "He has your nose," Elena said softly. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Victoria blinked, confused by the lack of venom. "What?" "Leo," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength, stripping away the fear that had ruled her for 5 years. "He has the Sterling nose, and he has Julian's stubbornness, but he has my heart." She took a step closer, bridging the gap that 5 years of lies had created. "You wanted to save a legacy, Victoria. You thought you were fighting a curse written in the stars. But look at him." Elena gestured to the boy on the chaise lounge. "That isn't a ghost. That isn't an omen of death. That is a lonely little boy who has spent 5 years wondering why his family didn't want him." Victoria looked at the child. Her hands, wrinkled and adorned with diamonds, gripped the armrests until her knuckles turned white. "He needs a grandmother," Elena said, her voice breaking slightly, not with weakness but with a profound, terrifying grace. "He doesn't need a ghost haunting the East Wing. He needs someone real. Can you be real for him? Or are you going to let your fear win?" Victoria let out a shuddering breath. Slowly, she reached out a trembling hand toward the boy. Leo, curious and sensing the shift in the room's energy, lowered his water glass. He didn't recoil. He reached out and touched the tips of the old woman's fingers. The contact was electric. Victoria gasped. She felt the warmth of his skin, the sticky residue of the fever, the pulse of life. It wasn't the cold touch of the grave she had feared for 3 decades. It was just a child. "He's warm," Victoria whispered, tears spilling over her cheeks again, but this time they were tears of clarity. The Sterling curse hadn't been broken by magic or ritual. It was shattered by the simple, undeniable reality of a child's touch. 30 days later, the gray, suffocating horizon of Blackwood Cemetery had vanished, replaced by the crisp, blinding brilliance of a December morning. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a dome of seamless, piercing azure. The mud that had once claimed Julian's dignity was gone, frozen solid under a blanket of pristine snow that sparkled like diamond dust in the sunlight. Julian stood by the tree line, but he wasn't wearing a suit of armor this time. He wore a heavy wool coat, a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a man at peace. Beside him, Elena stood in a coat of cream cashmere, her hair shining, the jagged scar on her cheek no longer hidden, but worn like a medal of valor. They watched in silence as a stonemason packed up his tools. The lie was gone. The granite headstone that had borne the name Elena Sterling for 5 years had been removed, carted away to be crushed into gravel. In its place stood a new, modest marker of white marble. Jane Doe, rest in peace, found but never known, honored in death. It was Julian's final order to the cemetery board. He couldn't give the unknown woman back her name. Victoria had buried that secret too deep, but he could give her dignity. She would no longer be a prop in their tragedy. "It's done," Julian said, his breath pluming in the cold air. Elena squeezed his gloved hand. "She's free, and so am I." Julian turned to her. The sunlight caught the gray in his eyes, turning them to silver. He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out the cheap brass locket he had found in the mud. That belonged to the past. He pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't kneel in the mud this time. He stood tall, meeting her gaze, treating her as an equal, a partner who had walked through hell and emerged carrying the fire. "I buried my heart here 5 years ago," Julian said, his voice steady, "and I found it again in the dirt of Newark. I don't want to restore what we had, Elena. What we had was fragile. It broke." He opened the box. Inside wasn't the delicate diamond of their youth. It was a sapphire dark and deep as the ocean, surrounded by resilient platinum, indestructible. "I want to build something new," he promised. "Something that no curse, no lie, and no distance can ever touch. Marry me. Again. For the first time." Elena looked at the ring, then at the man. She saw the lines of grief that would never fully fade from his face, just as the scar would never fade from hers. They were both damaged goods, refurbished by pain. She smiled, and it was brighter than the winter sun. "Yes," she whispered. "Ask me 1,000 times, Julian. The answer is always yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Daddy, look!" A shout rang out from the path. Leo was running toward them, his cheeks flushed pink with health, bundled in a thick parka. He was chasing something impossible in December, a lone white butterfly that had seemingly materialized from the warmth of the sun, dancing against the blue sky. Julian scooped his son up, swinging him into the air, the boy's laughter echoing through the trees, chasing away the silence of the dead. Elena took Julian's arm, and together, the three of them turned their backs on the graves, on the mausoleum, and on the shadows of the past. They walked toward the open gates, toward the waiting car, and toward a life that was finally, truly, their own. The camera pans up, leaving the cold earth behind, rising past the bare branches of the oak trees, up into the endless, terrifying, beautiful blue of the open sky. The tomb was empty. The living had gone home. The tomb of the living reveals that the most terrifying prisons are not built of iron bars, but of family secrets. Victoria Sterling attempted to preserve a legacy through deceit, only to realize that a bloodline without truth is already dead. The story stands as a testament to the resilience of love against the corrosive power of greed and superstition. It reminds us that wealth cannot insulate us from loss, and that true nobility is found not in a bank account, but in the courage to shatter comfortable illusions and fight for the messy, undeniable reality of the people we love. Now, if you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know which part surprised you the most. Every subscription and comment from you is a huge motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful stories in life. Thank you so much.